The nameplate bears someone else's surname. The contract bears my signature, which I never signed. Today, I am going to court to reclaim the house my mother built. I put the key in the lock of our house, and it didn't turn. On the mailbox, a different surname. My place has been taken without me. My name is Michael Clark. I am 32 years old. I haven't lived here for 9 years. After my mother's funeral, I went to work in another city. At the time, it seemed like the only way to keep from going crazy. I'm back now because I received a letter from a lawyer. Question regarding ownership of plot number 17B. Entry in the Register of Transactions, number 459/2016. One short line, and I'm 17 again. I'm sitting in the kitchen. My mother is in her apron, covered in flour, cooking something warm. She was the one who built the house on the hill. Every nail, every board, her work. She didn't say loud words. She just acted. The house was her way of loving. I stood in front of the door. The glass in the window was clean, but the curtains were unfamiliar. The door ring was new, shiny, round, without scratches. I took a breath. It smelled sweet inside. The smell of baked apples mixed with cinnamon, and everything inside tightened. My mother's voice seemed to echo somewhere behind me. You're safe here. I came without warning. I didn't want to coordinate with anyone. I just wanted to walk down the hallway, touch the kitchen table, open the cupboard where my mother kept her receipt book. Look at the garden, our 2 apple trees. I wanted to make sure that this was still my life, not someone else's story. On the box, Harris, not Clark. I was overcome with anger. I pressed the doorbell. No one came for a long time. Then the lock creaked, and a woman in a gray sweater appeared. She had a polite smile and a wary look. Excuse me, I said. I grew up in this house. I need to see the garden. She looked at me, at the old key in my hand, at my backpack. We recently renovated, she replied flatly. The garden is overgrown, but my husband plans to tidy it up. Who are you exactly? Michael Clark, Maria Clark's son. I'm sorry for your loss, she replied briefly. We bought the house a year ago through an agent. All the documents are in order, registration number HD 143/19. The word in order struck me. My garden is still here. The papers should be in my name, I said. We have different information. If you want, talk to our lawyer, Greg Morris, Harrison Development LLC. I can give you his contact information. I thanked her and stepped back. She closed the door. I stood on the porch like a courier who had gotten the wrong address. To the right was the hill where we used to put the fence posts. To the left was where the apple trees grew. They were nowhere to be seen. I wanted to walk around the house and take a look, but I stopped. It was now someone else's property. I remembered why I had left back then. After my mother died, everything fell apart. My father appeared with help, papers, a power of attorney, explanations that it would be the right thing to do. I believed that I was saving the house. I believed that the adults would take care of everything. And then work took me to another city, and I told myself, I'll come back when I get on my feet. I did. I came back. And here, a different surname. I opened my phone. On the screen, a letter from a lawyer. Questions regarding ownership of plot number 17B, deed of transfer, power of attorney dated 12/05/2016. Underneath, it was a scanned page from my mother's notebook. Tax payment, cadastral plan number 17B, register of transactions number 459/2016. Her handwriting was even and confident. It became difficult for me to breathe. I looked at the house again. The kitchen window was open. The wind carried the same smell of baked apples. For a second, I thought I could hear her footsteps. And then the air became normal. I realized that I would never go home again. Now I am a guest. And if I want to get what is mine back, I have to go through documents, not doors. I put the key in my pocket and dialed the number. Hello? I need the power of attorney and agreement documents for the last 9 years. The name is Maria Clark. Let's get started. Mom always said, we are our own team. And it wasn't just a phrase, it was our way of surviving. After the divorce, she was left with a small bag, me, and a few pieces of furniture that barely fit in someone else's garage. She worked at the post office and cleaned at a school on weekends. In the evenings, she would sit down with her notebooks and calculate how many bricks and how much paint we needed, and how much money we would have left for bread. I lay next to her on the floor, listening to the scratching of her pen, and tried to count along with her. Mom looked tired then, but focused, as if all this was already part of her plan. We bought the plot when no one believed that anything would come of it. A piece of land with weeds and an old shed. But my mother stood there, looked around, and said, "This is where our house will be. You'll see." And I believed her. We dug it ourselves. We held shovels, carried stones, and collected leftover boards from neighboring construction sites. When it was time to build the fence, my mother handed me an old brush and said, "The main thing is not to rush. Everything that is done with love lasts longer." I didn't fully understand her words at the time, but I painted carefully so that she would like it. We didn't have much, but she knew how to make something cozy out of nothing. The old sofa was covered with a blanket. The table was repainted white. The curtains were made from old sheets. Everything was simple but warm. The smell of the house also changed. Sometimes it was fresh paint, sometimes pie, sometimes damp wood after rain. And each of them was a part of our life. When I turned 10, my mother said that this house was not just a roof over our heads. It's a place where you can be yourself, even when the world outside is harsh. And I believed her. Even when it rained and the lights were turned off because of debts, we had our own warmth. I remember evenings in the kitchen, an old table, 2 cups of tea, a piece of pie that we shared in half. Mom talked about the future, about how I could do anything if I didn't give up. And most importantly, not to let anyone take away what we had built with our own hands. I promised myself then that I would never let her down, that I would be strong, that I would protect this home, that I would become who she wanted me to be. I didn't know yet how quickly everything would start to fall apart, and that the greatest threat would come not from outside, but from those I trusted most. At the bottom of her notebook was already written the date, May 12, 2016. She had managed to make an appointment. I hadn't. Mom always seemed strong. Even when she came home from work with swollen hands, she still put the kettle on and asked, "How was your day, son?" She said it so calmly, as if she hadn't just been dragging heavy bags of parcels around the warehouse. The first warning signs appeared imperceptibly. She began to forget little things, where she put her keys, whether she turned off the stove. Once she put the kettle on and forgot to turn on the gas. Another time, she went to town and couldn't remember why. She laughed. "I'm getting old, I guess." But I didn't laugh. Then the pain began. She hid it as much as she could. She said, "It's just a normal spasm, nothing to worry about." But I saw her holding her side when she thought I wasn't looking. And when she finally agreed to go to the doctor, it was already too late. I remember that day in detail. The smell of chlorine in the hospital corridor, the creaking of plastic chairs, the white line on the floor that I mechanically traced with my finger. The doctor spoke calmly, without emotion, probably because he was used to it. "Cancer. Stage 3. How long?" "Months. Maybe a year." She didn't cry. She just listened. Then she thanked him and said, "Then we have to hurry." I didn't understand. "Hurry what?" "Get everything sorted out," she replied. That evening, at home, she pushed her dinner aside and took a thick folder out of the drawer. Receipts, copies, contracts. "This is our home," she said, "but the land is still not registered. If something happens, it could go to anyone." "Mom, don't talk about it." "Mike, I have to." From then on, she sat over that folder every night. She collected references, bills, even attached my childhood photos. She said that everything should be done properly. I couldn't bear to watch her, pale and exhausted, rewriting numbers, barely holding the pen. "Lie down, Mom. You can finish later." "There may not be a later," she said simply. And she was right. One evening I came home late, covered in dust from my part-time job. She was sitting at the table by candlelight. The power had gone out again. She was writing in small, even handwriting. "Who are you writing to?" "The notary. Mr. Lamont. I want him to see me out of turn." "Mom, why do you need this paper?" "Because paper is what will remain when we are gone." I didn't know what to say. I stood and listened to the scratching of the pen. And for the first time, I understood. A home is not just bricks and a roof. It's a person who holds you up, even when they can barely stand themselves. Then the treatment began. IVs, chemotherapy, the smell of medicine, pale skin. I was angry at everything, at the doctors, at the system, at myself. But she held on. Sometimes, when I brought her apples, she would joke. "A little more, and I'll become an apple myself." And she would smile to make it easier for me. When things got really bad, I moved in with her. I slept in a chair next to her bed, cooked porridge, carried water, did everything I could. One evening she called me. "Mike, If I'm gone, go to your father. He'll help you. Mom, why do I need him? Because I trusted him once. And maybe now he'll do something right. I didn't argue. I just promised. Because she looked at me as if her peace of mind depended on my answer. A week later, she was gone. I remember everything. The white corridor, the smell of medicine, the silence. The nurse placed her belongings in my hands. Her glasses, an old wallet, a small cross on a chain. And that same folder. It was on top, tied with a rubber band. At home, I opened it. Dozens of pages in her handwriting. Bills, notes, phrases. Pay by the 15th. Submit application. Witnesses M. Read L. Glover. And a separate sheet. House Michael. Land, register. The main thing is to preserve. I sat on her bed, holding those sheets of paper, and felt helplessness suffocating me. I wanted to call her, ask what to do, where to find those damn numbers. But there was no one to call. And then I remembered her request. Okay, I'll turn to my father. Maybe this time he'll actually do something right. I didn't know yet that this promise, to turn to him, would be the beginning of everything that would destroy our home for good. The funeral was quiet. Mom didn't like crowds, and it would have been strange to see a crowd at her grave. Only those who were truly close to her came. Mrs. Lee, our neighbor, Aunt Joan, the accountant from the post office, a few colleagues, and me, her son, who stood there with numb hands, unable to even cry. I remember the sound of the earth falling on the wooden lid. A dull, hollow thud. Someone put a hand on my shoulder. I turned around. It was my father. I hadn't seen him in 11 years. He looked well, a little gray hair, good posture, an expensive raincoat, a calm face. A man who had everything under control. Hang in there, Michael, he said. She was a strong woman. Then he added quietly, I'm sorry it turned out this way. His voice sounded sincere, but there was such a gulf between us that no words could bridge it. After the funeral, he offered me a ride. We drove in silence. I looked out the window at the familiar streets, and he glanced at me from time to time, as if looking for a moment to speak. I found out about her illness too late, he finally said. She didn't want to see me. She didn't like lies, I replied. I didn't lie, he quietly objected. I just wasn't ready. Not ready. The same words he once used to explain his disappearance. Not ready for a family. Not ready for responsibility. Not ready to be a father. The car stopped near the house, my mother's house, to be precise. He stared at it for a long time, silently. She did a lot, he said. All with her own hands. Yes, I replied. And everything here is hers. He took a deep breath. Mike, I understand that now is not the time, but we need to sort out the paperwork. Her name is everywhere, and legally everything has to be transferred to my name. I'm an adult. I'm 23. You don't have any experience yet, he replied calmly. I'll help you. It's temporary, just so that everything is done right. To make sure everything is done right. At the time, it sounded like concern, but in reality, it sounded like a sentence. But I didn't see it that way. I was exhausted and trusting. I wanted to believe that this time he was really on my side. That same week, he took me to his office, a cold room with a shiny desk and a stack of papers. This is standard procedure, he explained, flipping through the sheets. Your mother didn't have time to complete some of the paperwork. We'll just confirm that I have the right to finalize the deal. I looked at the pages, not understanding anything. Legal terms, dates, names. This won't affect the property? I asked. No, it's just a formality, he assured me. He handed me a power of attorney. Power of attorney no. P.O. 1225 dated May 20th, 2016, signed by a witness, Notary Lamont. I signed. 1, 2, 3 pages. On the last page, I saw a new address and another name. Carolyn Grace Clark. Who is that? My wife, he replied calmly. We got married 2 years ago. Did she know my mother? No, but she respects her. And you too. She's a good woman. I said nothing. After signing, he suggested lunch. We sat in a cafe and ate in silence. He talked about work, about his new company, Harrison Development LLC, about his life with Carolyn. I listened, but heard almost nothing. All I could hear in my head were my mother's words. Don't give up this house. Hold on to it, even if you have to fight for it. That evening, I returned home and opened my mother's folder. I looked through the papers, bills, and her notes. And suddenly I noticed something. A blank line on the land transfer form in my name. She hadn't had time to sign it. I stared at that spot for a long time. Now he could do it. And I truly believed that he would do everything right. Because I promised my mother that I would turn to him. I wanted to believe that this time he would not betray me. That right meant honest. But even then, when I signed my name, I wasn't saving the house. I was giving it away. And under that signature was another one, not mine. Only I found out about it too late. Several months had passed since the funeral. Life seemed to have calmed down a bit. I tried to hold on. I went back to school, worked part-time, paid the bills. My father promised to help, but this help had a strange aftertaste. He rarely showed up, but when he did, it was always with the same phrase. You have to keep the house in order, Mike. And every time, there was something new behind those words, another change that I was the last to know about. Once, I came home for the weekend and didn't recognize the living room. Instead of my mother's worn-out sofa, there was a new one, leather, shiny, unfamiliar. My childhood photos were gone. In their place was a faceless painting of flowers. "Where are my things?" I asked. Carolyn, his new wife, replied calmly, even kindly. "We put everything in boxes. In the shed. It's dry and clean there. I just wanted to freshen up the space a little. Refresh it a little." She said it as if she had removed an old rug, not wiped away the presence of the person who had created this home. Carolyn was always polite, smiling, neat, proper. She cooked perfectly and spoke calmly, as if from a textbook. But when she was around, the air turned cold. She never forbade anything directly. She just said things that made me feel like I was in the way. "You're not staying the night, are you? We're having guests tomorrow. It's better to keep your things in the garage. There's more space there. Maybe we should give Mom's books to the library. Someone else will benefit from them." At first, I tried not to react. I convinced myself that these were trifles, that she just had a different understanding of comfort. But with each of her words, the smell I remembered evaporated from the house. Once I decided to repaint the fence, my mother had once taught me. The main thing is not to rush, then the paint will last longer. I took an old can of paint. Carolyn, passing by, said, "Oh, don't. We'll repaint everything in the spring. White fences aren't in style anymore." My father sat silently in a chair nearby. I looked at him, hoping he would intervene. He just sighed. "Don't argue, son. She wants things to be good here too." Good. He now repeated this word instead of right. And each time it sounded emptier. When we were alone, he sometimes spoke calmly, even warmly. "Your mother was incredible. I know what she did for both of us." "For me?" I corrected him. "For you and for me. It's just, I didn't have time to fix everything." I noticed how his hand trembled when he poured tea, how he looked away when I mentioned my mother. There was something human in him, fatigue, guilt, maybe even regret. But he chose to remain silent. And that silence always sided with Carolyn. Over time, the house changed. New things appeared, decorative candles, pillows, framed paintings. And ours disappeared. Mom's plates, children's drawings, the old teapot with the broken handle. "Where's the teapot?" I asked. "I threw it away," Carolyn replied calmly. "There's no point in keeping old things." That evening, I left late. There was a new teapot in the kitchen, metal, without a scratch on it. I looked at it and thought, in time, they will replace everything. Everything, every nail, every memory. When I left, my father was standing at the door. "You understand, we don't want to hurt you," he said. "It's just that life goes on." "Yes," I replied. "But not everyone wants to leave the past buried alive." He lowered his eyes. That night, I slept in my car near the hill in front of our house. At dawn, I smelled a faint scent of cinnamon, either the ghost of my mother's pie or just the neighbors baking something sweet. And I thought, the house is still breathing, just not with me. The next day, I went into the shed to get my things. There were boxes labeled, fabrics, dishes, to be given away. I opened the last one and froze. At the bottom lay a photocopy of my driver's license, with the wrong signature. I realized they were preparing to remove me from this house. On paper. When I arrived the next time, the door no longer creaked. Carolyn had oiled the hinges, so they wouldn't irritate the ears. Even that familiar sound was gone. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Light walls, new curtains, shiny floors, the smell of lemon cleaning products. There was no life in this shine. I walked into the kitchen. My place by the window was taken by decorative candles. And instead of my mother's tablecloth, there was a pristine white napkin. I touched the chair where she used to sit, cold, silent. You're here again without warning, I heard behind me. Carolyn stood in the doorway in her robe, calm and confident, like a hostess. This is my house, I said. She smiled slightly. It's ours too. We live here together now. She took out a cup, not mine. Mine, old, cracked, and inscribed World's Best Son, was lying in a box. On the lid, written in black marker, was for return. I opened the box. Inside were my books, photos with my mother, her notebook with bills. Why is this here? I asked. We were sorting through things, she replied calmly. We need to make room. The house shouldn't look like a museum. It's not a museum. It's her life, I said, feeling something tighten in my throat. We all let go of the past at some point, she shrugged. Otherwise, we can't move forward. I went out into the yard so I wouldn't suffocate. The garden was overgrown. The apple trees my mother and I had planted were bent by the wind. Under one tree was her old shovel, with rust on the handle. I picked it up and wiped the dirt off. Silence. Only the rustling of leaves. And in my head, her voice. You're safe here. Are you seriously going to keep this? I heard Carolyn behind me. We're thinking of selling the plot. The land is neglected anyway. Someone will build something nice here. I turned around sharply. This is not neglected land. This is the memory of my mother. Memories aren't square meters, she said calmly. They're inside you. I laughed. Not out of laughter, but out of helplessness. Inside me. You threw away her cup, her photos, her things. What else will you take away to make it easier for me? She was silent. And that soft, indifferent smile drove me crazy. My father came out of the house. What's going on? He asked. She wants to sell the land, I said. We were just talking, Carolyn interjected. Don't dramatize it. He approached cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. Mike, please. We've all suffered a loss. But we have to be practical. Bills, taxes. Your mother didn't have time to get everything sorted out. But I signed what you asked me to, right? To make it right? He lowered his eyes. That's different, he said quietly. We're just trying to tidy up. Tidy up means erase everything that's left of her. I clenched the shovel. This is her land. Her hands dug here. Carolyn took a step forward. Michael, no one is kicking you out. But we have to accept that time passes. We can't keep everything the way it was. I looked at her flawless appearance, at her calmness that smelled of coldness. You've already kicked me out, I said. You just haven't said it yet. I put the shovel down by the tree and walked to the car. In the rearview mirror, they stood side by side. He was silent, his head bowed. She touched his hand with a light movement. I drove away without turning on the music. In the window, the house that had once been my whole world slowly receded. And then the smell of lemon cleaning product seemed to change into something else. Warmer. Apples. Cinnamon. As if the house had taken a breath and whispered, "You're safe here." And I realized they weren't just cleaning me out of the house. They were wiping me out of history, like dust that no longer fits into their new life. Several years passed. It seemed that time had dulled what once burned inside. I lived in the city, worked, tried not to think about home. But sometimes, quite by accident, in a cafe serving Charlotte, I would catch the familiar smell of baked apples. And for a second, I would find myself there, in the past. And always the same thought. What's there now? Is our tree still standing? One day, Ed, a friend from my student days, called me. He was now working in the city administration. "Mike, you have a strange situation with the plot," he said. "What plot?" I didn't even understand at first. "With the house. The land is partially registered to Harrison Development LLC, and your signature is on it." I laughed, as if it were a joke. "Ed, I didn't sign anything. Maybe a long time ago. The copy is dated May 12, 2016. I froze. At the time, I was living on the other side of the state, working in a cheap cafe, clocking hours to pay for my education. I lived in an apartment overlooking the dumpsters. 3 years ago, I didn't even have copies of those documents. Ed sent me a photo. I opened it, and my heart sank. My name. My signature. Only not mine. Similar, but not the same. Like an imitation. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. It was cold, even though the radiator was nearby. Then I called my father. "Hello." His voice was calm and steady, as always. "Hi, Dad. I need to talk." "Mike? Long time no hear. Something happened? Did you sign something in my name?" Depends what you mean. His calmness frightened me more than any denial. Harrison Development. Sale of part of the land. My signature is on it. Ah. A short pause. Yes, we were processing everything at the time. You signed it yourself. When? It was a long time ago. You probably don't remember. I clenched the phone. You said it was just for taxes. That everything would remain mine. It did, he replied dryly. Don't be dramatic. We sold part of it to cover the costs. I was silent. My mother's words echoed in my head. Don't give up this house. Hold on to it, even if you have to fight for it. You sold Mom's land. It was shared, he said. Now it's just property, Mike. For you, it's property. For me, it's her. He exhaled. I don't want any arguments. We did everything legally. His voice was even. It contained everything: fatigue, indifference, justification. Just not guilt. After the conversation, I sat in the dark. On the screen was a photo with a caption. My name, which I had not signed anything with. The next morning, I drove to town. The road stretched endlessly, like a punishment. The closer I got to home, the more I felt a gnawing sensation inside me. Anger and fear. The house was still there. The same one, but with a new roof and a strange fence. On the gate was a sign that read, Harrison Construction, Project No. HD, 143/19. I stood where I used to paint boards with my mother, and I couldn't breathe. The lawyer's office smelled of dust and old coffee. A gray-haired man in a sweater took off his glasses. Sit down. Tell me everything in order. I told him. About my mother. About my father. About the signature. He listened silently, just nodding. When I finished, he said, if you didn't sign it, we need a handwriting analysis. But more than 7 years have passed. It's complicated and expensive. What if he did it when I was a minor? Then your father could have acted on your behalf. He was your guardian. I was stunned. Guardian. That word suddenly took on a completely different meaning. I looked at my hands. They were shaking, just like his had when he poured the tea. Only he hid his trembling, and I didn't. You can try to find a notary, said the lawyer. But without evidence, it will be a long fight. I thanked him and left. It was drizzling outside. I got in the car and just sat there. My phone rang again, a message from Ed. I checked. Agreement no. HD, 143/19. Notarized on May 12, 2016. But according to the archives, your mother died on May 6th. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. After her death, her power of attorney expired that very day. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers turned white. Now I knew. It wasn't a mistake. It was a forgery. But another fear was growing inside me. What if I really had signed something when I wasn't myself? Maybe he was telling the truth? I looked at my hands and saw my mother's. How they wrote in even lines. House, Michael. Land, formalize. The main thing is to preserve. And then everything fell into place. Maybe I was naive. But not so naive as to give up her house voluntarily. I opened my laptop and started typing. Requests to the registry, to the notary archives, to the city administration. I couldn't wait any longer. Two forces were fighting inside me. Shame that I had allowed this to happen, and anger that they had done it. The rain outside the window was getting heavier. I put my head on the steering wheel, closed my eyes, and whispered, Mom, I'll dig it all up. I promise. This time, without naivety, without trust. This time I will fight, even if I have to dig up the truth myself, from under each of their signatures. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not despair, but determination. Raw, painful, but alive. I knew I couldn't pull the truth out of the archives in one day. I needed people, those who were there at the time, who saw, heard, and remembered. Each of them could hold a small piece of the picture. I started with the simplest ones, my neighbors. Mrs. Lee lived across the fence. There were always pots of mint on her windowsill, and her house smelled of apple pie, the same kind we used to have. I brought the rolls and sat down at the table in the cramped kitchen. On the wall was a calendar with flowers, photos of grandchildren, the smell of cinnamon. Do you know anything about what happened after that? I asked. She looked at me for a long time, then put her hand on mine. I saw them coming, she said quietly. Often at night. I thought they were helping you with the paperwork. And then you disappeared. She did everything here with her own hands. I remember how we exchanged apples. She said, You're safe here. Her voice was warm and fragile, like an old film. I thanked her and wrote down every detail. Then there was Mrs. Rika, the accountant at the post office where my mother worked. She looked at me intently, as if checking to see if I was really her son. When I said my name, her eyes filled with tears. She was very precise, said Rika. I calculated the salaries, and she wrote everything down in a notebook. There was a flower in the corner of every page. She asked me to help her with the paperwork for the land. We went to the notary. She said, I want my son to have his own place. She took an old copy out of her bag, a statement of postal transfers. Here are the materials. Here are the taxes. She paid. She planned. The third was Aunt Joan, my mother's godmother. Her living room smelled of lavender, and on the sofa lay a green blanket, just like the one we used to have. Her hands trembled as she twisted her handkerchief. She wouldn't sell anything, she said firmly. She was afraid of only one thing, that the house would become a stranger's. And she brought an envelope. Inside were letters. Yellow paper, familiar, even handwriting. I may not have time to get everything done, but if something happens, Mike needs to know where to look. The notary is Mr. Lamont. The meeting is on May 12, 2016. The taxes have been paid. Don't give anything to anyone without my signature. It was the first real lead. I wrote down the date and the name. My heart was beating faster. Next was the bank. Cold shutters, the smell of paper, indifferent faces. I told my story, and the manager sighed and led me to the archive. Shelves, stacks of folders, yellow light. I searched for a long time and found it. The statement, transfers from my mother's account to the construction crew's account, receipts for materials, and most importantly, a note. Meeting at the notary on May 12, 2016. Subject, clarification of ownership. Present, M. Clark, T. Clark. 2 signatures. One was my mother's. The other was mine. Only this signature had a different slant and wave, like someone else's hand in my name. I made a photocopy. The air outside was frosty. I lit a cigarette, even though I had quit long ago. Smoking gave me time to gather my thoughts. Every person I spoke to held a piece of the truth, and between them there was a gap, where the notary should have been. I went to see Mr. Lamont. A narrow office, stacks of seals, a wooden table. He looked dry, but honest. Do you have copies? He asked, flipping through the pages. Yes. My mother wanted to register the land. Who signed it? He thought for a moment. If it was in May 2016, the records may still be in the archives. But I must warn you, sometimes documents were changed retroactively. Not all notaries were saints back then. His words hit harder than any yes. Someone could have rewritten everything after her death. I left. In my pocket were copies. In my head were fragments of voices. I opened my mother's old notebook. Between the pages where she kept her accounts, there was a small bag. Inside were copies of photos, old envelopes, and a note. Notary, Mr. Lamont, May 12, 2016. If I'm gone, look here. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel, and I gave myself an order. I will find everything, person by person, paper by paper, because these people still remember. And their memory is my eyes where I was not there at the time. It wasn't scary that I would find the truth. It was scary that I would learn more than I was ready to accept. But when I think about her handwriting on that yellow page, I realize I have no right to remain silent. Not after they erased her name from the house. Like dust, I realized that this was no longer a story I could handle on my own. I needed someone who knew how the small legal mechanisms worked, how to obtain archives, order handwriting analysis, and write requests correctly. I turned to a lawyer from the local newspaper, a simple man in a gray jacket, with a calm voice, without panic. Tell me everything in order, he said in his office, filled with file folders. I told him about my mother, the notary, the letters from my godmother, the bank statement, and the signature that looked like mine but wasn't mine. He listened carefully and took notes. There are 2 ways, he concluded. The first is amicable, official requests to your father and the company, a review of the contracts. The second is court. For court, you need as much evidence as possible. Witnesses, copies of payments, letters, signature analysis. The choice is yours. How long will it take? Months. And money. But if you want not just to get your house back, but the truth, there is no other way. I agreed. We sent out requests. To Lamont's office, to the registry, to the bank. The lawyer found a handwriting expert, a gray-haired man with a magnifying glass and a patient gaze. He sat me down at a table, and gave me some sheets of paper, signed several times, for a sample. I don't remember how I signed it back then, I said, because I didn't sign it. He just nodded and took the samples. A week later, the conclusion arrived. Expert Report Number 27/E, 2023. The signature on the contract with Harrison Development LLC was made by another person. There are signs of imitation, different pressure, and slant. The signs of forgery are obvious. I brought the report to my lawyer and felt as if the first crack had appeared in the wall. Not a victory, but a crack through which light could shine. We gathered witnesses, Mrs. Lee, Mrs. Rika, Aunt Joan. They agreed to testify that my mother had planned to register the land in my name and had carried the same notebook where she kept all her records. Each of their words was another nail in the coffin of truth that I had built with my own hands. But there were other conversations with my father. I asked him to show me the documents he had signed on my behalf. Everything is legal, he sighed. I did what I thought was necessary. Necessary for whom? I could barely contain myself. Mom wrote, "The land is mine." You saw her letters. You knew. We acted for the good of the family, he replied. Bills, repairs, taxes. It was necessary. He was silent for a long time after that, and that silence sounded louder than any excuse. At the same time, I studied the technical details. How contracts were drawn up, who signed on behalf of the company, what payments went through the bank. It turned out that Harrison Development was a small company, run by my father's acquaintance, Simon Lang. On paper, everything looked clean, but the chain was closed. The notary kept the case dated May 12, 2016. Registration number HD 143/19. Lamont confirmed that there was a note in the journal about my presence. But whose signatures were there that day? The question remained open. Sometimes I was overcome with doubt. What if I really did sign something then, in a state of shock? After the funeral, when I was not myself. Maybe he was right, and everything was legal? The doubts gnawed at me, but they also pushed me forward. I realized that court is not just about paperwork. It is also a battle with my own inaction, with the moments when I allowed others to decide for me. I practiced speaking clearly. I went over the story aloud many times, and I repeated her words, not as a memory, but as an oath. The main thing is to preserve. Finally, the package arrived. The expert's conclusion, bank transfers, neighbors' testimonies, and my mother's letter with the same date, May 12, 2016. Her handwriting, her signature, her will. I held that piece of paper and felt the house come alive inside me. The law may be cold, but the truth is alive. And I will speak not in the language of forms, but in the language she spoke. About dignity, about memory, and about a person's right to what they have created with their own hands. And this time, I will not back down. On the morning of the hearing, I washed my face twice. My whole body was shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization that today I would have to say out loud what I had been carrying inside me for so long. Near the court, my heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. The threshold seemed higher than it was. People walked by, averting their gaze. I took a number at the window and sat down to wait. My father arrived in a dark suit, Carolyn in an impeccable outfit with a simple handbag. They looked as if they had come to a social event, not a hearing to decide who was telling the truth. Their eyes glanced at me, briefly, coldly, and immediately turned away. The room was silent. My lawyer calmly laid out the folders. I clutched my mother's letters in my hand so tightly that they crumpled. The judge was a middle-aged woman, focused, without ostentatious severity. Mr. Clark, tell us why you believe the documents were forged and why part of the land should belong to you. I spoke slowly, without drama. I told her about my mother, her notebook, the date of the meeting with the notary, her request to register the land in my name, about the bank statements, about the expert's conclusion that the signature was not mine, about the neighbors who saw my mother with the documents in her hands. I didn't give a speech. I just told it like it was. How I was erased from my home, how the smell of apples and paint disappeared, how our life was replaced by someone else's walls. And it seemed that the judge felt it, not demonstratively, but through her attentive gaze. When my father spoke, everything became dry and official. His lawyer talked about the legality of the agreements, about guardianship, about formalities. He brought his documents, receipts, contracts. On paper, everything looked clean. They began to call witnesses. Mrs. Lee said that my mother had asked not to sell anything without her consent. Mrs. Rika brought a statement from the post office. Aunt Joan showed the same yellowed letters. Each piece of evidence was like a thread sewing together a torn canvas, a small thing, but alive. The judge took one of my mother's letters and read it aloud. The house, Michael. The land, register it. The main thing is to preserve it. The courtroom fell silent. These words sounded not like evidence, but like a prayer, and I felt something long forgotten echo within me. Not anger, but gratitude that at least someone had finally heard her voice. But the struggle continued. My father's lawyer raised the issue of the statute of limitations of legal grounds. The judge calmly replied, "We will appoint a handwriting expert, and we will check every document, starting from May 12, 2016. A notary, Mr. Lamont, was brought into the courtroom. He held a thick register covered with the dust of time. He turned to the page with the right date, seals, signatures, marks, and the same one that was in the contract. Only the slant and pressure were different. The judge frowned noticeably and made a note on the sheet. For the first time, I saw a doubt in her eyes. Not about me, but about the legality of those papers. After several hours of hearings, the judge announced a recess to decide on temporary measures. In the hallway, I stepped outside. The wind was cold, the sky gray. My father came closer. "Michael, we can work this out. There's no need to make a scandal out of it. The house is our shared memory." I looked at him. His compromise meant keep quiet. "A compromise," I said, "is when you admit you did something wrong. I don't want to take your house. I want you to give back what belonged to my mother and to me as her son." When we returned to the courtroom, I put my hand on her letter again. The judge read out the ruling. "Until the case is fully heard, it remains under judicial control. The house remains in its current possession. The garden plot is temporarily under the control of Mr. Michael Clark. All transactions involving the property are prohibited until the next hearing." It wasn't a victory, but it was the first official no to those who thought they could rewrite my mother's will. I felt a weight lift off my chest. It wasn't the end of the road, just the first step. After the trial, I stood at the foot of the hill and looked at the garden. My father was silent, trying to say something, but words were meaningless. Now only actions mattered. I thought about my mother's apples, about the house that smelled of warmth and paint. It wasn't about the land, it was about memories that cannot be sold or rewritten. The court recognized this, at least in part. As we drove home, the hill flashed by the window again, and I felt something new. Not anger, not fear, determination. If it takes another year, another 10 hearings, I will go through it all. For her, for myself. So that someday, when I return to the porch, I can smell baked apples again. The judge left the courtroom, and the noise subsided. People dispersed, some shaking hands, some looking sympathetically. I stood by the door, clutching a folder of documents, and felt a strange sense of relief. Not joy, not triumph, just silence. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like screaming. I saw my father in the parking lot. Carolyn was already sitting in the car, and he was waiting. "Michael," he said when I approached, "I know you hate me." "No," I replied. "I just don't trust you anymore." He lowered his eyes. "I made a lot of mistakes. I thought I was saving the situation." "Saving whom? Yourself?" "Maybe myself too." He smiled sadly. "I lost my mother and didn't know how to keep everything together." For the first time in years, I saw him without his mask. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling. "I'm really sorry," he said. "You can be sorry, but that won't change the facts." We stood in silence. Then he added, "If you want, we'll draw a clear line. The garden and the land are yours. You decide what to do with them." "Fine, but I'll take care of it myself. Without your formalities." Carolyn came over from the car, calm and composed. "Can I say something?" she asked. "I didn't mean any harm. I just did what I thought was right." "Right? You threw away everything that reminded me of my mother." "I couldn't live in another woman's museum," she said evenly. "But I didn't forbid you to remember her." Her voice was sincere in its own way, and I suddenly realized she really didn't consider herself guilty. Her truth just didn't match mine. "You don't have to apologize," I said. "Just stick to your part, and don't touch mine." She nodded, briefly, without emotion, and left. My father was still standing there. "We're moving," he said. "This is no longer our home." I didn't answer. Perhaps for the first time, he was right. When they left, I remained alone near the courthouse. The folder in my hands felt light. I got into the car and opened the window. The smell of wet earth wafted in. And suddenly I wanted to go home. Not to the house, but to the hill. I arrived there in the evening. The house stood quietly, without lights, with the shutters closed. The garden was neglected, weeds, dry leaves, branches. But life still lingered under the bark of the trees. I ran my finger along the trunk and felt warmth. I took gloves, pruning shears, and an old rake out of the trunk. I began to clean up leaves, branches, trash. Each movement was simple but important. There was no need to rebuild everything at once. Just take the first step. I worked until it got dark. Then I sat down on a bench near the apple tree. In the silence, I could hear only the wind rustling through the branches. And her voice came back to me. "You're safe here." I smiled. Now I was. Finally. The next day, I went to the lawyer to register the land. He checked the documents twice and stamped them. And then, for the first time, I felt at peace. Not because of victory, but because I had stopped fighting the past. Then my father called. "Mike, I hear you're cleaning up the garden." "Yes. If you need help, I'll come over." "No need. I can handle it." "Okay," he said after a pause. "Just be careful with the old apple tree. The roots are weak." I didn't expect that. But I guess he remembered this house too. He just couldn't live in its truth. When I hung up the phone, it became clear. Now there really was a boundary between us. Not just a legal one. A human one. He, with his silence, his choice, his Carolyn. Me, with my garden, my peace, and my words, which now sounded different. "You're safe here." That evening, I sat on the porch and watched as it grew dark. The wind touched the branches, and they gave off a faint scent of apples. Not like before, but real. And for the first time in many years, I didn't feel that someone owed me something. Because home is not walls. It's the memory you carry inside you, even when they try to erase you. And if it wasn't destroyed, then Mom was right. I really am safe. Several months passed after the trial when I returned to the hill, now officially as the owner of the land where my mother and I once planted trees. The house stood empty. The windows were closed. The weeds were knee-high. The mailbox had a different name on it, but it seemed like the mailman hadn't been here in a long time. The door was unlocked. The lock must have been broken during the move. I went inside. Silence. The air smelled of dust, paint, and something unfamiliar. In the corner stood a chair where my mother used to sit. On the floor lay a torn curtain. The smell of damp earth wafted in through a crack in the window. I felt no anger. On the contrary, I felt a quiet, calm sense that everything was finally over. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls. This was her kitchen, now empty, with only a stain from the stove on the wall. This was where our table used to stand. And before my eyes, I saw her, as she placed her hands on the edge and said quietly, "Everything will be fine. We'll manage." I went out into the yard. The garden was overgrown, but among the weeds stood familiar trunks. The first apple tree, the one we planted together, was half dead, with twisted branches. A few wrinkled fruits hung on it. I picked one, sour, almost rotten, but with a lively smell inside. The same one. From childhood. Under the tree, among the grass, something metallic glinted. A small garden knife with a wooden handle, my mother's. With the same scratch I had made when I dropped it on a rock. I knelt down, wiped the blade clean of dirt, and held it in my hands for a long time. Then I looked up, at the old apple tree, at the sky, at the hill. The world was peaceful. No drama. No anger. Just the world. I took a shovel from the car, drove in a few stakes, stretched a string, and began to dig. I removed weeds, cut branches, and leveled the ground. Not for anyone else, not to prove anything. Just so that the earth could breathe again. When the sun began to set, I stopped. The wind swept through the garden, and somewhere from the valley came the smell of baked apples. I don't know where it came from, maybe from the neighbors. But it was the same smell that once wafted from our kitchen. When my mother said, "You're safe here," I stood and listened. And I realized, it's true. Without her, without a home, without a nameplate, it was still true. Because safety is not found within walls. It is found in memories that no one can rewrite, forge, or sell. I sat down under an apple tree. The sky was darkening, streaked with red. I put the garden knife next to me, propped my head up with my hand, and sat there until it got dark. The house was no longer mine, but the land was, and everything that grows on it from now on will grow not from deception, but from memory. The following week, I brought several young seedlings. I planted them next to the old apple trees, not as a symbol, but simply because that's what she used to do. When I finished, I wiped my hands on my jeans, looked up, and for the first time in many years, I felt at peace. No regret, no anger, just clarity. Mom was right. I'm safe here.